Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 2 of the regular season between the Sharks and the Coyotes, in which the Sharks have lost 5-3. And it was pretty obvious after what happened in the first game between these two teams, which was a 4-3 shootout victory for the Sharks, that the Sharks would have to come up with a much better performance if they actually wanted to sweep this mini two-game series. But in the end, that is not what happened. The Sharks came up with a very similar performance from their forwards and defensemen. Their goaltender was significantly worse, and the Coyotes played just about as you expected them to play after their performance in Game 1 and ended up taking it 5-3. Now, this one actually started off quite well for the Sharks. It looked very promising. The first few minutes, it seemed to be mostly Sharks controlled, and they ended up getting the first goal of this game coming from Ryan Donato once again here on the power play, his first real goal as a Shark, not just shootout goal. But then the Coyotes struck back twice. They got goals from both Kessel as well as Hayton, and then it would be tied up by the Sharks. Timo Meier would get a pretty lucky bounce to tie it up at 2, and that would be the score at the end of the first period. And it's sort of like we came to a crossroads. Whether or not, these last 40 minutes, how they would go, would they be Sharks favored? Would the Sharks really wake up and actually sort of come alive for really the first time this season, besides the first few minutes, I guess, of this first period? Or would it just be the Coyotes continuing their general 5-on-5 dominance of the San Jose Sharks? Well, that ended up being what would happen. The Coyotes would add a couple more goals to the tally for themselves, one from Kessel, one from Chychrun, and then come third period, Keller would get yet another to put it 5-2 and potentially the nail in the coffin. The Sharks would get a late period power play, and that would have end up with a late period power play goal from Tomas Hertl, his third of the season, but it was more or less way too late, and the Sharks would drop it 5-3. So first thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. The goaltending was, of course, an interesting question coming into this year for the Sharks. Jones or Dubnyk, who would get more games? I had originally expected, especially early on in the season, that with how the schedule was structured, in the fact that every time the Sharks played a specific team, they would play them twice, that Jones and Dubnyk would more or less share starts between those two games. Jones would get one, Dubnyk would get the other, but I guess based on merit, Jones, after a very strong first game, ended up getting this second game. Well, the decision didn't end up working all too badly. It's not that I disagree with it, but clearly it didn't work too well. Martin Jones was not nearly as good as he was in that first game. A couple of these goals he absolutely would have wanted to have back. The fourth one, I think, deflected, but it's still not an impossible save to make. The second one was a great shot, but it's also from quite far out. So most of these, the Clayton Keller one, which was his the fifth goal for the Coyotes, was also very capable save. And so it was just a pretty all-around not so great game from Martin Jones, and it's something I'll get to even a bit later when I talk about my last point on the day. Dubnyk ended up getting some action here for the San Jose Sharks. He came in about halfway through-ish the third period, and well, we didn't really get to see much of him in action, but I do suspect Dubnyk will start the following game for the Sharks on Monday. Next thing to talk about would be Jacob Middleton. So, of course, while the Sharks managed to win, there were a few problems, especially with some of the newer players, and one of them was Milosh. He was just quite bad in his very few minutes that he played in the first game, so the Sharks looked down the line and ended up putting in Jacob Middleton as the sixth defenseman for themselves, while Nizov was still pretty decent, not great, a bit rough around the edges, but certainly not awful. Middleton came in and, well, it was not good, really, at all. When the Sharks had signed Middleton, he was expected to be the sixth defenseman for the Sharks this season. And I know a lot of people, for whatever reason, are actually not high on Middleton, but are quite sort of apathetic about him. They'll say, Middleton's a decent player. Every single time I've seen Middleton play, he has always not only not impressed me, but actually actively been very bad. Middleton, to me, has just been a very bad defenseman for the Sharks. And once again in this game, while he actually did have, I will admit, a couple of decent offensively oriented plays, it feels as though whenever he seems to have the puck in the defensive zone, it just ends up with a terrible play, a terrible giveaway. Somehow, even with probably 1/6 of the ice time combined of both Burns and Karlsson, he seems to have more combined giveaways than the two of them in this game. Middleton just continues to disappoint. I don't know if the Sharks have yet another option down the line. Pasternak is probably one that they could end up trying, and I do hope that Middleton does not gamp Game 3 because he was once again a massive disappointment. But this third defensive pairing, especially with Shemek continuing to be out, is seemingly not the biggest issue for the Sharks, but certainly one that is, pretty glaring in the end anyway. And finally, my last point is the 1920 San Jose Sharks. Now, what do the 1920 Sharks have to do with the 2021 Sharks? Well, instead of having felt like I watched a game January 16th, 2021, it kind of felt as though I was watching a game from January 16th, 2020, because it feels as though nothing has really changed from this year's San Jose Sharks to the previous season's San Jose Sharks, which was a team that was third last in the league, mind you. Besides the fact that Donato scored, that seems to be like the only thing that really separates this Sharks team from last year's Sharks team, as so many of similar signs continue. Inconsistent offense, players not really playing for their teammates, but mostly just sort of existing in their own little world, not really sort of working together, a lack of communication, terrible defensive zone coverage, players making very lazy defensive plays, a complete lack of defensive awareness, players like Burns, Carlson, and a lot of the forwards, it just feels as though the puck kind of just passes them by and they just watch it go by and they say, maybe I should have made a play. Like, they feel as though they're just sort of a second behind the play at all times, mediocre to below average goaltending, and it's just all of these things put together ended up with a third last team in the league last year. And while hopes were high that this season the Sharks might be able to compete for the final playoff spot in the West Division, with how the Sharks have looked so far in these first couple of games against, not even that great of a team, the Arizona Coyotes by the end of the season may not even be a playoff team themselves, and yet the Sharks just made the Coyotes look like the Vegas Golden Knights almost through these first couple of games. And if the Sharks can't have even moderate success against this team, how are they going to look when they play up against the much better Colorado Avalanche, Vegas Golden Knights, St. Louis Blues? Are the 8 games each against those teams all just sort of signed away as losses? Are they going to end up with a 0-8 record against those 3 teams? Because right now, with the way the Sharks are playing, they've just looked completely lost. And you would think that nothing has changed over this 10 months off season, that every single player just didn't really care with how the previous season ended, and they just say, well, let's just do some more of the same. Now, I don't mean to be so down about this team, coming in, and of course, it's a sort of caveat that I mentioned in the previous review where I said, well, the Sharks hadn't played for 10 months, maybe give them a bit more time to really get back up to game speed, but right now, you can't really blame a fan who just watched their team get to third last place in the league previous year and then complain of, you can't really blame them for complaining that in the following year when they come out with 2 sort of duds, even though they did technically win that game 1, you can't really blame that person for being upset. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Monday, and they will be facing off against one of those teams that I mentioned a bit earlier. That is the St. Louis Blues. The Blues are coming off of a 2-game series of their own against the Colorado Avalanche. They won that first game, but the second game they ended up losing 8-0, and I expect a massive response from the St. Louis Blues in their upcoming game against the Sharks, and we'll see if the Sharks, after a pretty disappointing 2-game series here with the Arizona Coyotes, can have a response of their own. Class dismissed.